Well, I'm Michael Israel Jarvis. It's hyphenated in case people want to write it down. And I write fantasy books, books for young adults or anyone who wants to read fantasy books, basically. I've written 3 so far. I've got 2 released on Amazon. Land Rising, Gravedigger, which was the first one I put out for Amazon. And the one I haven't yet released is Osric Fingerbone and the Boy Murderer, which should be out before April.
And is that the one that you're working on at the moment?
Yeah, I'm still in the editing sort of stages with that. I've got a couple of people, I've got a couple of friends that I can rely on who I know from university and elsewhere, including your lady, who have helped me.
She helps me as well.
Yeah, and very good to have that kind of support, really. And they just check through the file sometimes if they've got time and tell me if they've spotted any mistakes that I've missed, and then I do maybe 2 or 3 editing sweeps through the entire manuscript until I feel like I've done all I can. And then if I've missed something, it just goes to print anyway, so to speak.
So, because what I found interesting was, I spoke to you the other day about you were setting your style guidelines. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about that, but also, do you think it's is it something that you think that kind of fancy authors have to deal with more often because they have kind of more made up place names, or?
Yeah, I think it's funny. I use the term style guide. I don't have anything like a proper style guide publication would use, but it's with each book sometimes it's different. But I've got to make decisions about capitalization, sometimes spellings that are idiosyncratic compared to the rest of fiction. I think fantasy it is a more complex thing because you're dealing with stuff that isn't real, and you possibly have a little bit more freedom to use and abuse language to achieve an effect. And the job for me then is deciding when I've gone over that line, whether or not it actually works.
Yeah.
So our conversation was about capitalization of places and sometimes groups of people. That's usually where it comes up.
Fair enough, yeah. And so you mentioned that this is your 3rd one. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
So,
yeah.
And obviously, you kind of pick up things between each book that you write. Is there anything in particular that you've kind of learned from one book and then applied to the next one?
Yeah, well, the second book, the book I've released most recently, which was actually the first book that I wrote, but I didn't release it for a long time.
Okay.
That one's had 2 kind of editions. I think I did a brief, a very short run for some friends as a kind of test before I went to university of that book, and from that I learnt a lot of things about how you shouldn't form phrases in paragraphs, about missing kind of details of characterization that don't make sense. Basically, as you go, you look back on your work and you wince, and then you kind of make notes. And from that book, I picked up a lot of kind of basic kind of grammar mistakes, which luckily my readership at the time didn't notice.
Yeah.
And Gravedigger then was stronger, and it was stronger mainly because it was less formulaic, arguably.
Yeah.
I was much younger when I wrote Land Rising.
Yeah.
I still love Land Rising and its characters, but it definitely follows the pattern of fantasy novels more. Gravedigger is a little bit more funky, a bit more interesting and off the beaten path, I think. And so I learnt some. I hesitate to say originality because that's so rare, but I learnt something a bit fresher coming up to Gravedigger. And with Osric, I've been focusing more heavily on character and kind of allowing the space I'm using, the locations I'm using to create an atmosphere that kind of works with the characters.
Yeah.
It feels more cohesive, more complete, but then that's helped by the fact that I'm setting it in a semi-realistic location, I have to say.
So, and obviously, I suppose one of the problems you have to deal with is kind of as a fantasy author, a lot of the worlds aren't necessarily real, so you're dealing a lot more with your own imagination. I mean, how much planning do you have to put in so that you know all the little details that make a world a world?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is the trick is to make the world at least real to a degree. So all of my fantasy worlds and most of the worlds that I read about in work of other fantasy authors are recognizable to our world in at least most ways. I think that works better. It gives you more grounding. But there's going to be some differences, like you say. So there's going to be some research, and most of it, I think the most useful research in creating a world comes with its people.
Yeah.
Doing some kind of basic anthropology kind of work is really, really useful if you're a fantasy author, because the culture, perhaps the language, the types of, right down to something as simple as the types of weapons that other people would use, setting time and place. That's really useful because it creates kind of markers for the reader, and they go, oh yeah, I recognise that.
Yeah.
And if you create enough of those points, it kind of creates a network, and then they feel comfortable. And it feels real then. I think, I don't know if it was George R. R. Martin, but somebody much better in my field said that it should be real. And if you're writing and it's not real, it doesn't matter whether it's fantasy or another form of fiction, it doesn't work.
Yeah, no, that's
It's
true.
got to be real for you.
I mean, to what extent would you say are the characters? I mean, are they kind of a result of the environment as well? I mean, I know it's often said that people are, and also, do you ever find that they kind of that they're so alive in your head that they kind of almost make their own decisions and act in ways that you hadn't necessarily predicted?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, the idea of the kind of natural environment making its own decisions, and then the characters particularly making decisions for you. Yeah, I've got better at letting that happen. I've got to say, the first book I wrote, Land Rising, I was probably pushing the characters around a little bit more than I have done since, and making them do things because it was required. Yeah. So there's more of a sense of destiny. A lot of fantasy books that have a real strong sense of destiny have this problem, if you want to call it a problem. And with Gravedigger, I never had a plan for the plot. Yeah. It kind of happened, and I just followed it. Luckily, they went in the right direction, I think. So, yeah, once you get the sense that your characters are disagreeing with you, you realise that you're not normal. So, yeah, it's a great thing. It's just you talk to the wrong person about it, and they think you're crazy. Again, I'm going to reference George R. R. Martin twice, which is probably a mistake, but he likens there's two kind of two systems. You've got the gardener system and the architect system of writing, particularly writing fantasy, where you can build everything, plan everything, and then build everything intricately like an architect might, or you can allow it to have some organic growth. Yeah. And I try to kind of mix the two. I like to do a lot of forward planning, but when it actually comes to the events within that world, I think it should have some of its own freedom.
So if what I was going to ask is obviously with Gravedigger, you said you sort of allowed it to develop by itself. So what did you do in terms of actual sort of planning and preparation if you kind of didn't lay out the storyline?
Well, it's funny with Gravedigger particularly, because when I started writing it, I wasn't setting out to write a book, which is for me so far fairly unusual. Yeah. I started writing something as an exercise. I wanted to write something, and here's the irony, very traditional fantasy. Okay. I wanted to write something very predictable, very kind of, just wanted to play with tropes and see how I was doing with them. And what I got was the first couple of chapters where Perrin meets Cassel. And it went from there, and I kept going, and I realised that I not only was I enjoying it, but a lot of readers who I posted on DeviantArt when I'm working on a new project were enjoying it too. And yeah, it was. I began thinking to myself, am I going to have to sort of plan out a skeleton plot for where this is going to go, or am I going to just risk that it might not go anywhere and keep writing? And I started making tiny little jumps ahead in my head, but I kind of kept myself from making a huge leap. It's why I think for some people perhaps Gravedigger ends slightly abruptly, perhaps, and that worked for me because it felt like the way that things work when they're not managed, when they're not plotted out completely with complete rigor. You get strange things that happen. You get an ending that is unexpected, and that felt good to me. It felt different to me, and it allowed me to set up a sequel as well.
Yeah, it always helps. Um,
Yeah.
cool. So we're sort of running out of time now, but we'll ask a couple more questions. So, firstly, what are you reading at the moment? What book are you reading?
Right. Well, at the moment I'm reading works by various. I'm struggling to get their minds into my head, by a few writers who deal with Renaissance Florence.
Okay.
So non-fiction, historical, popular history works. One's called April Blood. That's the one I'm actually reading at the moment. I've just finished reading the Medici, chronicling the Medici family in Florence. And the reason is that's all preparation for the sequel to Gravedigger, because I'm needing to give myself a lot more information, a lot more comfort with political intrigue and decision making in a kind of semi-legitimate, semi kind of criminal way that you get with the Renaissance power structures, particularly in Italy.
Cool.
That sounds very boring now.
No,
yeah,
no.
the sequel to Gravedigger will be, I'm hoping not so different that it's jarring, but it will have a very different feel in terms of how events come about. There's a lot more sense of control and manipulation involved.
Cool. And
not by me, I hasten to add.
And when are you hoping to sort of get that sequel out? As I know you've got a lot on your plate, so.
Yeah. Well, there's if you want to direct people to my Facebook author page,
yep.
Which is it's facebook.com/michael.israel.jarvis. Then I did at one point put out a kind of tentative, this is what I plan to do for the next 10 years post, which is probably horribly unwise. But if I'm remembering rightly, I actually have a decision to make once I've released Osric Fingerbone and The Boy Murderer. I have to decide whether to focus my attention more on the sequel to Land Rising, which is definitely my bestseller so far,
yeah.
or on Gravedigger, which is possibly my preferred project at the moment. So it's a difficult one. I might end up writing both of them at the same time, which will give both of them a delayed release date, but they'll both come out sooner overall.
Yeah, that makes sense. And cool. And Osric as well. When's that due to come out?
Well, I've made a promise that I'll bring it out before my wife's birthday in April, because she really wants to read it by then. So
no pressure.
So yeah, I'm going to try and do it at the very, very least before the 21st of April, and if possible, if I can bring it out sort of the term between the beginning of April, that would work for me very well, I think.